Tap, tap, tap. The sound of my manicured nail against the polished mahogany of my desk echoed in the dead silence of the executive boardroom. Marcus was trembling, his tailored Italian suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for his deflating frame. The man who once sneered that I wasn't fit to breathe the same air as his elite circles was now staring up at me. His face, the sickly color of wet ash. "I didn't just buy your debt, Marcus," I whispered, keeping my voice dangerously low. Perfectly steady, I leaned forward, letting the gravity of his absolute ruin settle over him. "I bought your legacy. I own the buildings you named after your father. And as of 9:00 a.m. this morning, your entire empire is worth exactly zero. Before I take you back to the beginning and show you exactly how I dismantled this so-called billionaire's ego piece by piece, I want you to do something for me. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world are you listening from right now. Make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. And settle into somewhere comfortable, because the story I am about to tell you is a masterclass in calculated, cold-blooded karma. 3 years ago, I was not the apex predator of Wall Street that Marcus saw in that boardroom. To him, and to the glittering, superficial circle of New York's elite he desperately clung to, I was just Zola, a quiet, unassuming freelance data analyst from a modest African immigrant family. I wore simple, unbranded wool coats, drove a highly sensible, 5-year-old sedan, and generally faded into the background of his vibrant, chaotic life. Marcus, on the other hand, was the golden boy of Manhattan commercial real estate, or at least, that was the grand illusion he aggressively sold to the world. If you look at the current United States economy, you know the truth? With interest rates choking the market, inflation squeezing profit margins, and massive commercial skyscrapers sitting utterly empty in the wake of remote work shifts, his industry was a financial bloodbath. But you would never know it by looking at him. Marcus masked his bleeding corporate balance sheets with loud arrogance. He leased the newest, obnoxiously loud sports cars, bought VIP tables at exclusive velvet rope clubs he couldn't actually afford, and flaunted a lifestyle built entirely on a rapidly crumbling foundation of high-interest mezzanine debt. He was a hollow shell painted in gold leaf. I played the role of the devoted, culturally grounded, supportive partner with flawless execution. When his mother, Eleanor, a woman whose face was pulled so tight by cosmetic procedures she could barely form a genuine smile, would look down her nose at my simple thrifted accessories and make passive-aggressive remarks about my lack of generational producers.com pedigree, I simply smiled. I absorbed the disrespect, not because I was weak, but because I have always operated on one fundamental truth. If you want to truly understand how a predator hunts, you must first convince them that you are nothing but prey. Marcus treated me less like an equal partner and more like a mildly embarrassing placeholder. I was the safe, boring bet. The quiet woman who kept his penthouse organized and offered him emotional stability while he chased the exhausting illusion of supremacy. He genuinely believed my silence was submission. He thought my extreme frugality was a symptom of poverty. He had absolutely no idea that while he was drowning in leveraged loans just to keep his country club memberships active, I was quietly building a financial fortress in the shadows. I watched him constantly belittle service workers to inflate his own fragile ego. I listened to his late-night phone calls, hearing the pathetic, high-pitched panic in his voice, as he begged private lenders for 30-day extensions, only to wake up the next morning and berate me for not understanding the complexities of high-level wealth generation. The human ego is a remarkably fragile vulnerability. Marcus was so profoundly blinded by his desperate need to project superiority that he never bothered to look beneath the calm surface of the woman sleeping next to him. He never asked about the specific nature of my data analysis clients. He never wondered why my simple, unassuming laptop required a dual-layer biometric encryption. To unlock, he thought I was worthless. He thought I was entirely expendable. And he was about to prove just how deeply and fatally he underestimated me. The stage was set for the ultimate betrayal. And he was handing me the matches to burn his world to the ground. The air at the annual Hamptons summer solstice gala always tasted like a specific cocktail of sea salt, expensive champagne, and quiet desperation. It was the social event of the season. A glittering masquerade where New York's elite gathered to lie to each other about their net worth. I stood near the edge of the sprawling estate's infinity pool. Holding a glass of sparkling water, I was dressed in a simple, unbranded midnight blue silk slip dress, an authentic 1940s vintage piece that whispered elegance. The room around me, however, was screaming. It was a sea of ostentatious, logo-heavy designer gowns and aggressively tailored tuxedos. Tonight was supposed to be the night. For weeks, Marcus had been dropping heavy, arrogant hints about a monumental announcement regarding our future. I had spent 3 years organizing his life, listening to his rants, and playing the supportive anchor to his chaotic ship. Suddenly, the clinking of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the low hum of networking. Marcus stood on the grand marble staircase, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the chandeliers. He flashed his signature, rehearsed smile, the one he used to charm gullible investors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus boomed, his voice echoing over the manicured lawns. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the expansion of my real estate firm, but the expansion of my legacy. A man building a dynasty needs an equal, a woman of true, undeniable pedigree." He extended his hand down the staircase. But he wasn't looking at me. From the shadows emerged Chloe. She was everything Marcus thought wealth was supposed to look like. Loud, blonde, and dripping in heavily branded jewelry. She wore a gaudy, sequin designer gown. My trained eye instantly recognized it. It was a late-season outlet piece, heavily discounted due to a structural flaw in the bodice seam. But to the untrained eyes in that room, she looked like $1,000,000. "I am thrilled to announce my engagement to the brilliant heiress, Chloe Kensington," Marcus declared, kissing her hand. The applause was deafening. The collective gaze of the room slowly, cruelly, shifted toward me. I could feel the pity. I could feel the muffled laughter. Before I could even process the absolute audacity of his public betrayal, a shadow fell over me. The suffocating scent of synthetic gardenia perfume assaulted my senses. It was Eleanor, Marcus's mother. She looked me up and down, her heavily Botoxed face twisting into a mask of pure elitist disgust. She leaned in close. Her voice, a venomous hiss, meant only for my ears. "Did you honestly think he would put a ring on a nobody from the outer boroughs?" Eleanor sneered, her eyes raking over my unbranded silk dress. "Look at you, wearing someone else's old, thrifted rags. You were a convenient distraction. Zola, a little charity case to make him feel philanthropic. But my son is a king. And a king doesn't marry a peasant playing dress-up. You don't belong in our tax bracket. And you never will. Now, take your cheap little purse and leave through the service exit before you embarrass us further." This is the moment in the movies where the heartbroken woman bursts into tears, slaps her ex-boyfriend, or runs away sobbing into the night. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't tremble. My heart rate didn't even spike. Instead, time seemed to slow down. I looked at Eleanor. I looked past the hostile glare and saw the terrifying reality of her existence. I noticed the slight, uncontrollable tremor in her hands, a classic sign of chronic financial anxiety. I noticed that the diamond necklace she wore was catching the light poorly, indicating it was high-grade cubic zirconia. Not a flawless cut. They were putting on a pathetic, desperate theater production. And they were utterly bankrupt inside and out. I didn't feel heartbreak. I felt an absolute oppressor. Freezing. Terrifying clarity. I looked Eleanor directly in the eyes. I didn't yell. I didn't defend myself. I simply gave her a microscopic, chilling smile. Enjoy the illusion. Eleanor, I whispered, my voice completely devoid of emotion. While it lasts, I didn't use the service exit. I turned around and walked straight through the center of the ballroom. The crowd parting for me. My spine was made of titanium. I walked out into the cool Hamptons night air. Leaving the fake billionaire and his counterfeit heiress to their doomed fairy tale, they thought they had just taken out the trash. They didn't realize they had just unleashed a monster. The gravel of the Hamptons estate crunched beneath my heels. The only sound accompanying my departure, I walked past the line of flashy, leased sports cars, until I reached the dimly lit end of the driveway. Waiting for me was a heavily armored, matte black SUV. It wasn't flashy. It was impenetrable. As I approached, the rear door swung open. Good evening, Mom. My driver, Elias, said quietly, his eyes fixed firmly ahead. Shall I take you to the Vanguard Apex headquarters? No. Elias, I replied, sliding into the plush, soundproof leather interior. I let out a slow, controlled breath, feeling the heavy, suffocating persona of Zola the modest freelancer physically melt off my shoulders. Take me to the sanctum. It's time to go to work. An hour later, I was standing in my actual home, a sprawling, minimalist penthouse, occupying the entire top floor of a discreet Tribeca high-rise. There were no gaudy chandeliers here. No forced displays of wealth, just floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass overlooking the glittering, chaotic grid of New York City, and the quiet hum of state-of-the-art server racks hidden behind a soundproof wall. I poured myself a single glass of 20-year-old, small batch single malt, taking a moment to savor the smoky burn. Then, I sat down at my desk. 3 massive, curved monitors flickered to life, bathing the dark room in a cold, blue glow. I bypassed the dual-layer biometric encryption, pressing my thumb to the scanner, and logged into the mainframe of Vanguard Apex. For the past 5 years, I had been the phantom architect behind one of Wall Street's most ruthless and successful private equity firms. We didn't build companies, we hunted the weak ones, bought their distressed debt, and cannibalized their assets. I opened a new terminal window. It was time to dissect a fake billionaire. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, tapping into commercial real estate databases, municipal tax records, and shadow banking ledgers. The current U.S. economic climate is unforgiving, especially in commercial real estate. If you don't have liquid capital, the inflation and rising interest rates will swallow you whole. It took me exactly 42 minutes to bypass Marcus's corporate firewalls and map out the financial anatomy of his empire. What I found was even more pathetic than I had anticipated. Marcus wasn't a king, he was a hostage to his own ego. His entire portfolio was built on toxic assets and over-leveraged, floating-rate mezzanine debt. With the recent Federal Reserve rate hikes, his monthly interest payments had skyrocketed. His flagship commercial towers in Manhattan were sitting 50% empty, bleeding cash. He was entirely insolvent, surviving month to month by moving money between shell companies in a desperate, illegal game of financial musical chairs. Next, I ran a deep-dive forensic sweep on Eleanor. She had mocked my clothes, calling me a charity case. The irony was physically nauseating, cross-referencing her offshore accounts with the public tax filings of her prestigious Children's Literacy Foundation. I found the leak. She had been systematically embezzling donation funds, funneling the money through a dummy corporation in the Cayman Islands to pay for her country club dues, her cosmetic surgeries, and her synthetic gardenia perfume. Finally, I turned my attention to the glittering prize. Clue. The heiress. A simple background check shattered her diamond-studded illusion. Her family's trust fund had evaporated in a series of disastrous stock shorts nearly a decade ago. Chloe had absolutely nothing. She was drowning in subprime auto loans and maxed out high-yield credit cards. Her entire life was funded by predatory tensions as ADN and payday-style loans. She had targeted Marcus as a life raft. Completely unaware that she was boarding a sinking ship, I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the blue light of the screens reflecting in my eyes. They were a trinity of frauds, 3 hollow people clinging to a decaying cliff of debt, desperately pretending they could fly. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt a cold, surgical sense of purpose. Have you ever looked at someone who has wronged you, completely destroyed your trust, and suddenly realized you hold the absolute power to dismantle their entire reality? It is a terrifying, beautiful clarity. Marcus had publicly stripped me of my dignity because he thought I was powerless. He thought I was an outsider looking through the glass of his exclusive world. He didn't realize I owned the glass, and I was about to shatter it. I didn't launch my counterattack with a screaming phone call or a dramatic confrontation. True power is never loud. It is the silent, terrifying shift of the tectonic plates beneath your feet. I didn't want to destroy Marcus quickly. I wanted to suffocate his empire so slowly, so methodically, that he would feel every single breath being stolen from his lungs. If you have ever been made to feel small, if you have ever sat in silence while someone arrogant and entitled belittled your worth or made you feel like you didn't belong, listen closely to this part, because this is how you rewrite the balance of power. My first strike was purely structural. Through a labyrinth of anonymous shell corporations and offshore holding companies controlled by Vanguard Apex, I began aggressively acquiring Marcus's debt. His private lenders were desperate for liquidity in this volatile U.S. market, and I offered them cash buyouts at a premium. Within 72 hours, I was the sole owner of 80% of his high-interest commercial loans. I was now his god, and I was an angry one. I instructed my legal team to enforce every single microscopic covenant in those loan agreements clauses Marcus had arrogantly signed without reading, assuming his lenders would always give him grace. Suddenly, grace was gone. We demanded immediate proof of liquidity. We initiated random, grueling audits. When his flagship construction project in Chelsea fell 3 days behind schedule, I used my leverage to place a freeze on his escrow accounts. Sitting in the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse, I monitored his corporate servers. I watched, like a hawk, circling a dying rabbit. As the internal emails flooded in, the subject lines went from confident to concerned, and finally, to blind panic. His contractors were walking off job sites because the checks were bouncing. His desperate emails to his new father-in-law for a capital injection were met with dead silence because, as I knew, Chloe's family didn't have a dime to lend. Next, I severed the oxygen supply to his enablers. Through a Vanguard subsidiary that specialized in subprime debt collection, I purchased the portfolio that held Chloe's maxed-out credit lines. I immediately flagged her accounts for high-risk fraudulent activity. I wasn't there to see it, but my private investigator sent me the surveillance footage. Chloe was at an exclusive bridal boutique on Fifth Avenue, trying on a custom Vera Wang gown she had no intention of paying for. When she handed over her platinum card, the machine didn't just decline. It flashed a hard confiscation code. The polite, thinly veiled disgust on the sales associate's face as she cut the card in half with a pair of silver scissors was poetry in motion. Chloe stormed out, her face flushed with a humiliating shade of crimson, violently dialing her bank while clutching her knockoff Birkin bag. But my favorite masterpiece was reserved for Eleanor. Eleanor relied on her Children's Literacy Foundation credit card for her daily dose of opulence. I simply drafted an anonymous, highly detailed tip to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, outlining the exact Cayman Island routing numbers she used to embezzle the charity's funds. The IRS works slowly, but banks do not. The moment the preliminary inquiry was opened, the foundation's accounts were frozen pending review. The following afternoon, Eleanor was at her weekly caviar and champagne brunch at the country club, a club where the initiation fee alone was $100,000. When the waiter discreetly brought the bill, her card declined. She laughed it off as a clerical error. Handing him another. Declined. A third. Declined. By the time the club manager was called over to ask her to leave the premises, the entire dining room of her elite, judgmental peers was watching in dead silence. The woman who had sneered at my thrifted clothes was suddenly standing in the middle of a Michelin-starred dining room. Unable to pay for her own mimosa, from my monitor, I watched the dominoes fall perfectly into place. They didn't know who was orchestrating this nightmare. They just knew the walls of their carefully constructed reality were suddenly, violently crushing them. The trap was set. Now, it was time to watch the rats turn on each other. There is a profound psychological phenomenon that occurs when people whose entire identity is built on money suddenly run out of it. It doesn't just change their lifestyle, it violently strips away the thin veneer of their humanity, without the buffer of extreme wealth. Marcus, Eleanor, and Chloe were exposed for exactly what they were: feral, terrified, and profoundly disloyal. Sitting in my penthouse, parsing through the intercepted audio feeds from Marcus's office, I became an invisible audience to their spectacular collapse. The pressure cooker I had built was finally whistling, and the rats were beginning to cannibalize each other. The first massive fracture occurred between mother and son. Marcus had called Eleanor into his office, a space that was already echoing. As the repo men had quietly removed the imported Italian leather sofas the day before, the audio recording was crystal clear. Marcus was screaming, his voice cracking with a hysterical, high-pitched edge I had never heard during our 3 years together. He was begging Eleanor for a massive loan from her charity to cover his collapsing payroll. Completely unaware that her accounts were locked under a crippling federal investigation, Eleanor's response was a masterclass in narcissistic deflection. Instead of confessing her IRS nightmare, she viciously attacked his manhood. She called him a profound disappointment, shrieking that his father would be disgusted by his pathetic incompetence. The polished, heavily medicated society matron was gone. In her place was a desperate, cornered woman, lashing out with venomous cruelty to protect her own shattered ego. Then came Clue. Like any parasite sensing a dying host, Chloe immediately tried to detach. The facade of the devoted, pedigree-rich fiancé crumbled the second Marcus admitted he couldn't finance their $2 million destination wedding in Lake Como. My private investigator's surveillance showed her frantically packing her garish, logo-heavy suitcases in Marcus's penthouse, screaming into her phone to an ex-boyfriend, begging for a place to crash. But I couldn't let her slip away that easily. She had chosen to play the game, and she was going to stay on the board until checkmate. With a few keystrokes, I compiled a meticulous dossier of Chloe's true financial state: the defaulted payday loans, the repossessed leased vehicles, and the humiliating reality of her drained family trust. I encrypted the file and anonymously leaked it to every major New York society blog and financial gossip columnist. Within 2 hours, her phone started exploding. She wasn't just broke, she was a viral joke. When Marcus discovered the articles, the confrontation was apocalyptic. He realized he hadn't dumped me for a billionaire heiress. He had dumped me for a grifter who was deeper in the gutter than he was. The audio of them screaming at each other, realizing they were two drowning people who had latched onto each other for survival, was a symphony to my ears. By Friday morning, the desperation was absolute. Marcus was facing not just total bankruptcy, but potential federal indictment for the illegal commingling of funds he had attempted in a blind panic earlier that week. He was pacing his barren office, sweating through his wrinkled bespoke shirt, staring out the window at a city that had thoroughly rejected him. It was time to throw him a lifeline. Or, more accurately, an anvil painted to look like a life preserver. I instructed the senior acquisitions director at Vanguard Apex to send Marcus a formal, unsolicited proposal. The terms were brutally, almost illegally, one-sided. Vanguard would assume his toxic corporate debt and provide just enough capital to keep him out of federal prison. In exchange, he would surrender 99% equity of his entire holding company, effectively erasing his ownership to a sane businessman. It was a death warrant, but to a man terrified of wearing a prison jumpsuit, it was a miracle. I watched the encrypted notification flash on my center monitor as his digital signature was hastily scrawled across the preliminary agreement. He had taken the bait. He thought a faceless, massive Wall Street entity had just spared him from total annihilation. He had absolutely no idea that he had just invited the Grim Reaper into his boardroom. The Vanguard Apex executive boardroom on the 60th floor was designed for one specific purpose: psychological intimidation. It featured a massive 20-foot table carved from a single slab of obsidian, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying frame, godlike view of the Manhattan skyline. When Marcus, Eleanor, and Chloe were ushered in by my silent security detail, they looked like sheep walking into a slaughterhouse. Marcus was sweating through his collar, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. Eleanor looked visibly aged. Without the funds for her weekly aesthetic touch-ups, the stress had carved deep, haggard lines into her face. Chloe sat as far away from them as possible, furiously biting her nails, her counterfeit designer bag clutched to her chest like a shield. They were expecting a team of faceless corporate executives to walk in and sign the bailout papers that would keep Marcus out of federal prison. Instead, the heavy oak doors swung open, and I walked in alone. I was no longer the quiet girl in the thrifted wool coat. I wore a charcoal gray, bespoke suit, tailored from pure vicuña wool, a fabric so exquisitely rare it cost more per yard than Marcus's remaining liquid assets. On my wrist, peeking out from the cuff, was a vintage, unpolished Patek Philippe Grand Complication. It was quiet, devastating, absolute luxury. Marcus blinked, his brain completely failing to process the visual information. He stood up, a mixture of utter confusion and residual arrogance twisting his face. Zola, he stammered, his voice cracking. What the hell are you doing here? Did you get a temp job here? Listen, I am in the middle of a multi-million-dollar acquisition. You need to leave before you embarrass. I didn't say a word. I simply walked past him, my heels clicking rhythmically against the Italian marble floor, and took my seat at the head of the obsidian table. The CEO's chair. I placed a single, thick manila folder on the table. The silence in the room became so heavy it was suffocating. You don't own a multi-million-dollar anything, Marcus, I said, my voice smooth, calm, and chillingly steady. I leaned back, resting my hands on the armrests. Marcus turned the color of wet ash. Eleanor let out a sharp, pathetic gasp, her hand flying to her throat. I am the founder and majority shareholder of Vanguard Apex, I stated, locking eyes with him. And you are sitting in my building. I opened the folder. 3 days ago, you signed the preliminary terms of your bailout. You surrendered 99% equity of your holding company in exchange for Vanguard assuming your debt, giving us full operational discretion to restructure or liquidate. Zola, please, Marcus whispered, his knees literally buckling as he sank back into his chair. You tricked me. I didn't trick you. I just let you be exactly who you are. A financially illiterate, arrogant fraud who doesn't read the fine print. I tapped my manicured nail against the desk. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't just buy your debt. Marcus, I bought your legacy. I own the buildings you named after your father. And as of 9:00 a.m. this morning, your entire empire is worth exactly zero. I am not restructuring your company. I am liquidating it for scrap. You are officially bankrupt. I turned my icy gaze to his mother. Eleanor, do you remember telling me I was a charity case? That I didn't belong in your tax bracket? She was trembling so violently, her teeth were chattering. I slid a beautifully bound 50-page document across the table toward her. This is a courtesy copy of the forensic accounting report I personally submitted to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. It details every single Cayman Island routing number you used to embezzle from the Children's Literacy Foundation. Federal agents are currently seizing your estate. You aren't just broke. Eleanor, you are going to federal prison. Finally. I looked at Chloe. She burst into violent, messy tears, shaking her head. Save it. I snapped, my tone cutting through her fake distress like a scalpel. The media already has your defaulted payday loans and your drained trust fund, but I also bought the debt on your maxed-out credit lines. I'm calling them in. Today, you will be paying off your fake lifestyle for the rest of your natural life. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket with deliberate slowness. I looked down at the three of them broken, sobbing, and utterly destroyed. You thought you were apex predators, I whispered, the cold satisfaction settling deep in my chest. But you were just loud. True power is quiet, and it never, ever forgets. I pressed the silver intercom button on the desk. Security. Escort these three individuals out of my building. If they resist, call the police. 6 months later, the dust had completely settled over the ruins of Marcus's fabricated empire. In the high-stakes ecosystem of American finance, when you fall from grace without a golden parachute, you don't just hit the ground, you shatter into a million irrecoverable pieces. I didn't need to hire a private investigator to know where they ended up. The public records and the harsh reality of the current U.S. economy told the entire story. Marcus avoided federal prison by the skin of his teeth, entirely because I absorbed his toxic assets and insulated the market from his catastrophic negligence. But salvation from prison did not mean salvation from poverty. The man who once leased a $250,000 sports car to project dominance now takes the subway. He works as a mid-level shift supervisor at a high-volume, subprime auto loan call center in New Jersey. Under the brutal, buzzing glare of fluorescent lights, wearing a cheap, heavily starched polyester blend dress shirt that irritates his skin. He spends 10 hours a day reading from a laminated script, begging financially distressed people to make their minimum payments. The irony is so perfectly engineered. It is almost poetic. Eleanor's descent was far less graceful. The IRS does not negotiate with embezzlers who steal from children's charities to avoid a 10-year mandatory sentence. She liquidated every single piece of jewelry, every designer bag, and every hidden asset she possessed to pay restitution. She now lives in a damp, ground floor, one-bedroom apartment in a deeply noisy section of Queens, wearing a cumbersome GPS ankle monitor, without the capital to maintain her endless cosmetic procedures. The underlying architecture of her face has collapsed. The heavy, sagging lines of her true age and profound bitterness are now permanently on display for the world to see. And Chloe, the fake heiress who thought a discounted, poorly stitched sequin dress made her royalty, Vanguard Apex's debt recovery division legally garnished 40% of her wages. She is currently employed as a fitting room attendant at a massive, heavily trafficked discount department store off the interstate. Every single day, she stands on her feet for 8 hours, picking up the cheap, discarded garments of the very working-class people she once considered entirely beneath her. As for me, I am sitting on the terrace of my Tribeca penthouse, wrapped in a pure, undyed cashmere robe, watching the sunrise paint the Manhattan skyline in brilliant shades of gold and violet. I am drinking a cup of single-origin pour-over coffee. The quiet steam rising in the crisp morning air. I didn't destroy them out of blind rage. I dismantled them because they broke the fundamental rule of human decency. They mistook kindness for weakness. And they used their artificial privilege to step on the throat of someone they deemed invisible. They learned the hardest lesson this world has to offer. The loudest person in the room is always the weakest. True power doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't need to cover itself in obnoxious logos or humiliate the waitstaff to feel important. True power is quiet. It is patient. It operates in the shadows, analyzes the variables, and waits for the exact, perfect moment to strike. And when it does, the destruction is absolute. So, I have to ask you, did I go too far? Or did Marcus, Eleanor, and Chloe get exactly the kind of ruthless karma they deserved? Drop down into the comments right now and tell me what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have walked away? Or would you have burned their empire to the ground? If this story gave you that ultimate sense of satisfaction, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a perfect revenge story. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next time we serve up cold, hard justice. Thank you so much for listening. Stay smart, stay quiet, and I'll see you in the next one.